On a cold night by the harbor, two young girls found themselves in a danger no child should ever face. One of them was taken by ruthless men, and the other, a brave little soul, risked everything to save her friend, unaware that this child carried a secret that could change lives forever. She was the daughter of a billionaire. Stay with me, because what unfolds is not just suspense, but a lesson about courage, forgiveness, and the true power of family. To everyone listening, I send you warm wishes of health, peace, and love. Tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from, and what time is it right now? High above the busy streets of Boston, in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Charles River, Garrett Halloway sat alone at a table far too long for one man. Below, the city pulsed with life headlights moving in steady streams across the bridges, laughter spilling from crowded restaurants, the muffled hum of trains rolling through. But inside the apartment, silence reigned. You could hear the faint scrape of silver against porcelain, the only sound in a dining room meant for gatherings but used as a solitary stage. The meal was impeccable. A cut of steak cooked medium rare, a drizzle of burgundy sauce, mashed potatoes whipped with butter, a scattering of fresh greens. The household staff had left long ago. Garrett always dismissed them early. He told himself it was efficiency, privacy, control. The truth was simpler, though harder to admit. He had no desire for company, even the paid kind. One place setting, one chair drawn from a dozen, that was his nightly ritual. Garrett was a man who measured life in contracts, signed, and deals closed. At 56, he had built his technology empire from the ground up, and the city knew his name. Newspapers described him as relentless, sharp, unyielding. But those same qualities that made him formidable in boardrooms had turned his home into an echo chamber. Power gave him everything he thought he wanted, and quietly took from him what he did not know he needed. At the far end of the hall, however, a faint glow slipped through the crack of another door. In that smaller room, Elena Halloway, 8 years old, sat on her bed with a worn teddy bear tucked under her chin. She had waited for her father as long as she could, watching the digital clock blink past dinner time, past homework hour, past the moment she should already have been asleep. Elena had a way of filling her own silence. She lined up her stuffed animals as though they were classmates, whispering questions to them, pretending they whispered back. Tonight, though, she wasn't in the mood for make-believe. She had wanted her father to come in, even for 5 minutes, to hear about the harvest festival at school. They were decorating pumpkins in the auditorium, and she had thought he might smile if she told him about the one she painted to look like a little fox. When at last she heard the faint clink of cutlery down the hall, her heart lifted. She slid off the bed, padded barefoot toward the dining room, and stopped in the doorway. There was her father, shoulders straight, jaw tight, eating with the measured precision of a man still half in a meeting. "Dad?" Her voice was small, hopeful. Garrett looked up, as if startled to find anyone else in the apartment. For a beat, he simply stared at her, his fork hovering midair. "Elena, shouldn't you be in bed?" "I just wanted to tell you something," she said quickly, holding the teddy bear close. "About the harvest festival. We're going to have apple bobbing, and games, and maybe you could come." Garrett set his fork down with a sigh, rubbing his temple. "I don't know, honey. My schedule is—" He stopped short, noticing the disappointment flicker across her face. "I'll see what I can do." It wasn't a yes. Elena knew the difference. She nodded anyway, giving him a quick smile, the kind children practice when they're trying to hide a sting. Then she padded back down the hall, the bear's soft ears brushing against her cheek. Garrett watched her go, the silence closing in again as though she had never been there. He turned back to his plate, but the food had gone cold. Back in her room, Elena pulled the quilt up to her chin. The teddy bear, faded from years of being carried everywhere, was tucked beneath her arm. She whispered to it as though it could answer. "It feels like I don't even have a dad," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could swallow them back. The child's voice never carried down the hall. Garrett sat in the dining room, unaware of what had been spoken, finishing his meal in silence. But even if he had heard, he might not have known what to say. Words of comfort did not come easily to him. He had trained himself to speak in numbers, strategies, bottom lines. Tenderness was not part of his vocabulary. After the dishes were cleared away, he insisted on tidying some things himself. Those staff would return in the morning. Garrett loosened his tie and stepped toward the living room. The penthouse stretched wide and gleaming. Art on the walls. The faint scent of leather from the furniture. The hum of an expensive refrigerator in the distance. Yet no matter how polished everything looked, the rooms seemed hollow. A space designed for many, but occupied by one. He lowered himself into a leather chair beside the tall windows. The city lay beneath him like a jeweled blanket, streetlights glimmering, the Charles River reflecting neon reds and yellows. Somewhere across that river, families were gathered at kitchen tables, laughing over pie, passing mashed potatoes, teasing one another about football scores. Garrett remembered faintly what such evenings felt like, though memory had blurred them with time. A mother's voice, a father's steady hand on his shoulder, echoes from a life far behind him. The thought of his own daughter, lying awake just down the hall, pressed against him. He told himself she had everything. Security, education, a future already carved out in marble. But something restless gnawed at him when he thought of her walking away disappointed, carrying her stories to no one but a toy bear. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Another late-night email, another proposal flagged urgent. Garrett glanced at it, then silenced the device with one motion. For once, he had no appetite for the endless cycle of business. Instead, he leaned back, letting the lights of Boston wash over him through the glass. A memory surfaced unbidden a different autumn, decades ago, when he had walked through cobbled streets with someone whose laughter warmed him in a way no skyscraper ever could. He pushed the image away, as he always did. The past was not useful. It could not be changed, and it had no place in the empire he had built. Still, an ache lingered. Elena shifted in her sleep, the faint creak of her bed carrying into the stillness. Garrett heard it, just barely, and for a moment he thought of getting up, of walking down the hall to sit at her bedside, to ask about the fox she had painted, to promise he'd come to the festival. But inertia held him. The walls between them were not only made of plaster and paint. He remained in his chair, staring outward. The river rolled steady. The skyline glittered bright. Planes blinked red in the night sky as they approached Logan Airport. All the movement in the world seemed to pass by while he sat immobile, heavy with choices he hadn't made. Garrett looked out through the glass walls at Boston's glittering skyline, but deep inside, he still felt an emptiness he couldn't name. Just a few miles from Garrett Halloway's glittering tower, the streets looked very different. In South Boston, the air carried the scent of fried food drifting from corner diners, the chatter of neighbors echoing off brick walls streaked with graffiti. Old triple-decker houses leaned against one another like weary companions, their paint chipped but their porches decorated with pumpkins and plastic skeletons for the season. Down one of those narrow streets ran Sophie Marlowe, a small paper bag clutched tight against her chest. The bag wasn't heavy, just a loaf of bread, a few carrots, and a can of soup. But Sophie carried it like treasure, weaving between puddles left by a passing rain, her sneakers slapping softly against the pavement. She was 7 years old, with dark hair tied back by a fraying ribbon, and eyes that seemed to hold more curiosity than fear. When the grocer had handed her the change, she had counted the coins twice, careful not to lose even a nickel. Every cent mattered in the Marlowe household. At the top of a narrow staircase sat Evelyn Marlowe, her grandmother, waiting by the door with a sweater draped over her thin shoulders. 70 years had curved her back and lined her face, but her eyes were gentle, carrying the steady patience of someone who had raised children and grandchildren through lean times. "You're late, sweetheart," Evelyn said as Sophie bounded up the steps, breathless. "I had to wait in line," Sophie explained, showing the bag like a prize. "Look, I got the bread you like, and they had carrots on sale." Evelyn took the bag with a smile, kissing the top of her granddaughter's head. "Good girl. Come inside before the chill gets you." The apartment was small, 2 rooms, a kitchen that smelled faintly of boiled potatoes, and a worn sofa with crocheted blankets folded neatly on its back. Sophie set the table while Evelyn ladled chicken soup from a pot that had been simmering all afternoon. It wasn't much, but the warmth filled the space in a way no chandelier or leather chair could. As they ate, Sophie's voice bubbled with stories from her day, the games at school, the way her teacher laughed, the stray cat she had seen curled on a fire escape. Evelyn listened, nodding, sometimes laughing, sometimes sighing. Then Sophie asked, as she did from time to time, her spoon hovering over the bowl, "Grandma, what about my mom and dad? What were they like?" Evelyn's hand froze. She set down her spoon slowly, staring into the steam rising from the soup. "Some stories," she said softly, "can wait a little longer." Sophie frowned. She didn't push, but her chest felt heavy with questions that never found answers. Later, as she curled under a patchwork quilt, Sophie whispered to the ceiling, "I wish I had a dad, someone who could come to school festivals or fix things when they break." The words drifted into the night, carrying a longing too old for a child her age. The next morning began with the clatter of buses on the street below, their brakes squealing as they stopped to pick up workers heading into the city. Evelyn brewed a pot of weak coffee, its aroma filling the small kitchen, while Sophie buttered a slice of bread with careful strokes as though it were a task of great importance. "Don't forget your jacket," Evelyn reminded her, folding Sophie's homework into her backpack. "It's colder today. The wind's turning." Sophie wrinkled her nose but obeyed, shrugging into the oversized coat handed down from a neighbor's child. The sleeves nearly covered her hands, but she didn't complain. She hugged Evelyn goodbye, then hurried down the stairwell, her shoes tapping against the old wooden steps. South Boston in the morning was alive with familiar faces. The man at the corner diner flipping pancakes, women sweeping their stoops, children dragging backpacks larger than themselves. Sophie loved this part of the day. She knew nearly everyone, and they knew her, always ready with a wave or a smile. School passed in a blur, reading lessons, arithmetic drills, recess games in the cracked asphalt yard. But what Sophie carried home wasn't the worksheets tucked in her bag. It was the sight of other children greeted by their parents at the gate. A hug from a father, a kiss on the cheek from a mother, the easy way they reached for their children's hands. Sophie tried not to stare, but sometimes she lingered just a little too long. That evening, Evelyn served the last of the soup, stretching it with water and a few potatoes. They ate quietly at first, listening to the distant wail of a siren somewhere across the neighborhood. Sophie toyed with her spoon before speaking, her voice small but firm. "Grandma," she began, "do you think people can live their whole life without ever meeting their real dad?" Evelyn set her spoon down again. She had grown used to Sophie's questions, but each one seemed to cut a little deeper. "Some do," she said carefully, "but others. Sometimes life brings people together in ways you don't expect." Sophie tilted her head, as though trying to decide whether that answer was enough. "If I ever meet him," she said, almost whispering, "I'll tell him I waited." Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed her granddaughter's hand. Her smile was gentle, but her heart ached. There were truths folded away, like letters in a locked drawer, truths she had guarded for years. Telling them would change everything, but silence weighed heavier with each season. After dinner, Sophie sat by the window, sketching in her notebook by the dim light of a lamp. Evelyn watched her, the pencil moving with determination across the page. A fox, perhaps, or maybe a pumpkin. Sophie loved to draw things she saw in store windows, trying to capture brightness on the thin paper. When bedtime came, Sophie curled beneath the quilt once more. She whispered into the quiet room, "I just wish I wasn't the only one without a dad." Her eyelids fluttered shut, but the ache in her voice lingered long after she fell asleep. Evelyn tucked the blanket higher around the girl's shoulders, then sat for a long time in the stillness. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, carrying the salt of the harbor. Evelyn looked out the window, the wind picking up, her gaze heavy as though she carried a secret too great to share. Evening draped itself over Boston like a quilt stitched with neon lights and early autumn chill. Near Faneuil Hall, the market stalls were closing, their awnings pulled down, the smell of roasted nuts and cider still lingering in the air. Musicians packed up guitars, the crowd thinning as families made their way home. Elena Holloway walked beside her father, trying to match his long strides. Garrett had promised her a short stop at the marketplace after his late meeting, though his phone buzzed constantly in his hand. Each time she tugged his sleeve, eager to show him a balloon vendor or a pumpkin display, his eyes darted back to the glowing screen. "Dad, can we just look for a minute?" she asked, pointing toward a stand with caramel apples. "Maybe another night," Garrett murmured, his gaze fixed on a new email flashing across his screen. Disappointment crept into Elena's chest, but she didn't argue. She slowed her pace, trailing behind him, and in those few distracted seconds, the crowd shifted. A group of teenagers pushed through, loud and careless, and Elena was swept a few steps off the main path. By the time she turned, Garrett was gone from sight. Her small body stiffened. The chatter of the crowd suddenly felt louder, harsher. She clutched the hem of her coat and spun around, searching. The cobblestones beneath her shoes seemed to tilt. For a moment, she felt very, very small, in a world too large. From the edge of the marketplace, Sophie Marlowe appeared, her paper bag of groceries tucked against her chest. She recognized the look of fear instantly. She knew it herself, in nights when the apartment felt too empty, or when sirens wailed outside their window. "Hey," Sophie called softly, approaching. "You lost?" Elena blinked, her eyes wide, relief mixing with uncertainty. "I can't find my dad," she whispered. Just then, a couple of teenagers noticed Elena, their laughter turning sharp, teasing. "Oh, look at the little princess," one jeered, stepping closer. "Daddy's girl, all alone." Elena's breath caught. She stepped back, bumping into Sophie, who stood firm, her shoulders squaring though she was half their size. "Leave her alone," Sophie shouted, her voice cutting through the dusk. Her eyes blazed, small fists clenched at her sides. The boys snickered, but before they could press further, the sharp beam of a flashlight swept across the cobblestones. A pair of officers, making their evening rounds, spotted the commotion. The teenagers muttered curses and slunk away, disappearing into the alleys. Elena's knees wobbled with relief. She turned to Sophie, grasping her hand tightly. "Thank you," she breathed. "You're really brave." Sophie shrugged, trying to look casual, though her heart still thumped against her ribs. "You just needed somebody to stand with you." For the first time that night, Elena smiled, her fear melting into something warmer, trust, even admiration. The marketplace crowd had already begun to thin when Garrett finally realized Elena was no longer beside him. His pulse jolted as he scanned the square, the glow from his phone forgotten in his pocket. He moved quickly through the cobblestones, searching the faces that blurred past him, every step heavier than the last. "Elena." His voice echoed, sharper than he intended. Then he saw her standing near the edge of the market, her hand clasped tightly around that of another girl. The officers who had frightened off the rowdy teenagers were moving on, their footsteps fading. Relief crashed over Garrett, though it was laced with something else. Shame, perhaps, that he had been distracted enough to let her slip away. He strode forward, his coat billowing behind him, and swept Elena into his arms before she could speak. "Don't ever run off like that," he said, though his voice cracked at the edges. "Do you know how dangerous it could have been?" "I didn't run," Elena protested softly. "I got pushed." She turned, pulling Sophie a step forward. "But she helped me." She made them go away. Garrett's gaze shifted to the girl. Sophie stood with her chin raised, though her shoes were scuffed, her jacket frayed at the sleeves. There was something striking about her eyes, steady, unafraid, far too old for a child her age. "What's your name?" Garrett asked, his tone softening despite himself. "Sophie," she replied, gripping her grocery bag tighter. "Sophie Marlowe." Garrett nodded once, then returned his focus to Elena, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Elena leaned closer to Sophie.
"Can I walk with her a little? Just until we get to the car?"
Garrett hesitated. He wasn't used to strangers intruding into his world, least of all children from streets so different from his own. But the way Elena looked at Sophie with gratitude, with something that resembled admiration, gave him pause. The three of them walked together through the cobblestones, the night settling deep over Boston. Vendors called last words to customers. The air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts cooling on metal trays. Garrett stayed close, one hand firmly around Elena's shoulder, his other still clutching his phone like a lifeline. When they reached the black sedan waiting at the curb, the driver stepped out to open the door. Sophie shifted back, ready to leave, but Elena held onto her hand. "Thank you, Sophie," Elena said earnestly. "You were like a sister tonight." Sophie's cheeks warmed. She wasn't used to words like that. "I just didn't want them to be mean to you." Garrett studied the two girls, his daughter in her pressed coat, and the stranger in second-hand clothes who carried herself with surprising courage. Something about the scene tugged at him, though he couldn't place why. As Sophie turned to go, Elena clung to her father's arm, insisting, "Dad, can she come visit us sometime, please?" The following Saturday, Elena woke earlier than usual, her excitement impossible to contain. She tiptoed into the kitchen, hair still tousled from sleep, and found her father already at the table with a cup of black coffee steaming beside him. "Dad," she began breathlessly, "remember Sophie? From the market?" Garrett looked up from his newspaper. "Yes, I remember. Can she come today? Just for a little while? I want to show her my room and the rooftop garden and—" Elena hesitated, her smile hopeful. "She doesn't live far." Garrett hesitated. His weekend schedule was stacked with calls, yet he saw the eagerness shining in his daughter's eyes. Against his instinct to keep the world neatly divided, he finally nodded. "If her grandmother agrees." And so, by late morning, Sophie stood at the entrance of the glass building that scraped the Boston sky. She craned her neck, eyes wide, as the doorman greeted her politely and directed her toward the elevators. She had never stepped inside a place where the walls gleamed like mirrors and the floor smelled faintly of lemon polish. When the doors opened on the top floor, Elena was waiting, bouncing on her toes. "You made it!" she cried, pulling Sophie into the penthouse. The contrast struck Sophie immediately. Wide windows revealed the Charles River, the kitchen glowed with stainless steel, and the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly. She clutched the strap of her backpack a little tighter, suddenly aware of her patched jacket and the scuff marks on her sneakers. "Come on," Elena urged, tugging her hand. "I'll show you my room." They dashed down the hall, giggling, leaving Garrett to watch from the living room. He leaned back in his chair, curious despite himself. He hadn't expected to see Elena so alive, so eager to share. Inside the bedroom, Elena proudly displayed her bookshelves, her drawings taped to the wall, her collection of dolls lined neatly in a row. Sophie touched none of it, only gazed with quiet wonder. "You can play with them," Elena encouraged. "They're not just for looking." Sophie smiled faintly, choosing the smallest doll, stroking its hair as though it were porcelain. "She's pretty," she said softly. The girls talked and played until lunchtime, when Garrett appeared at the doorway. "Would you both like something to eat?" he asked, his voice less formal than usual. Elena beamed. "Yes, please. Can we have grilled cheese?" Garrett almost chuckled. It wasn't what he had expected her to request, but he gave a nod. Grilled cheese it is. For the first time in years, Garrett found himself at the stove, buttering bread and laying cheese slices in between. The girls sat at the counter, whispering to each other, their laughter filling corners of the penthouse that had long stood silent. When he placed the sandwiches in front of them, Elena clapped. "Dad, you did it!" Sophie bit into hers cautiously, then smiled. "It's really good," she said. Garrett, startled by the warmth of her praise, simply inclined his head, but something in his chest shifted. He watched the two girls eat side by side, their feet swinging above the high stools, and for once, the penthouse didn't feel so empty. That afternoon, the sun sank lower, pouring amber light across the skyline. The two girls sprawled across the living room floor, crayons scattered around them, drawing pumpkins and foxes on thick paper Garrett had found in a drawer. Their voices rose and fell in easy conversation, the way children slip into friendship as though it had always been waiting. Garrett lingered at the edge of the room. He had turned down 2 phone calls already, something he would not have believed possible even a week earlier. Yet somehow, watching Elena and Sophie laugh together, the urgency of his business seemed smaller. Elena looked up at him suddenly. "Dad, can Sophie stay for dinner?" Before Garrett could answer, the elevator bell chimed. A knock followed firm, measured. He frowned, not expecting visitors. When he opened the door, Evelyn Marlowe stood there, her posture straight despite her years. She wore a simple coat, her gray hair pulled back neatly, eyes steady and calm. "I came to fetch my granddaughter," she said, her voice polite but edged with caution. "I hope she hasn't been any trouble." "No trouble at all," Garrett replied, though he studied her carefully. There was something familiar in the way she carried herself, in the quiet strength of her presence. Inside, Sophie sprang up, rushing to hug her grandmother. "Grandma, you should have seen the view." And Mr. Halloway made grilled cheese himself. Evelyn's brows lifted slightly, but her expression softened as she smoothed Sophie's hair. "That sounds like a fine afternoon, dear," Elena piped up, tugging at Garrett's sleeve. "We were drawing. Can Sophie take hers home?" "Of course," Garrett said. He gathered the pages, handing them to Sophie, who accepted them with a shy smile. Evelyn's eyes lingered on Garrett for a moment longer. There was no hostility, only a depth that seemed to reach backward in time. carrying stories left untold. She nodded her thanks, but when she turned toward the door, Garrett felt an unease coil in his chest. As Sophie waved goodbye and Evelyn guided her into the hallway, Elena whispered, "Can she come again, Dad? Please?" Garrett forced a smile. "We'll see. M." He closed the door slowly, but before it latched, his gaze caught Evelyn's once more. In that instant, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of recognition, of memory buried too long. Garrett caught the look in Evelyn's eyes and felt a chill, as though the past had just knocked on his door. The drive north to Salem took less than an hour, but for Elena, it felt like a grand adventure. She pressed her nose against the car window, watching the trees whip by, their leaves aflame in shades of crimson, orange, and gold. Every few minutes, she gasped, pointing out another farmhouse decorated with hay bales and scarecrows. "Dad, look! That one has 10 pumpkins on the porch!" she exclaimed. Garrett allowed himself a small smile, though he kept both hands on the wheel. He wasn't used to weekend drives through winding country roads, but Elena's excitement softened the weight of his usual schedule. Sophie sat quietly in the back seat beside her grandmother, Evelyn, her eyes wide with anticipation. She had never been to Salem's famous festival. When they arrived, the town was buzzing. Lanterns carved from pumpkins glowed along the sidewalks, vendors sold spiced cider from steaming pots, and fiddlers played lively reels in the square. Families strolled hand in hand. Children darted toward candy stalls, and the air carried the scent of caramel and roasted nuts. "This is amazing," Elena breathed, tugging Sophie's hand. "Stay close," Garrett cautioned. But his voice lacked its usual edge. Even he could not deny the charm of the scene. The girls hurried toward a booth where children were bobbing for apples. A line had formed, parents cheering as dripping faces emerged triumphant. Elena begged to try, her eyes sparkling. "Please, Dad? Just once?" Garrett hesitated, then nodded. "All right, go ahead." Sophie followed her eagerly, though she looked uncertain as she bent over the tub of water. Elena plunged in first, her hair falling forward, and emerged with a shiny red apple clutched between her teeth. She threw her arms up in victory, and the crowd around her clapped. Sophie laughed, encouraged, and tried herself missing twice before finally catching one. Both girls squealed, their cheeks rosy from the cold water. Garrett stood nearby, watching them with an expression he rarely wore, quiet amusement. He noticed the way Sophie encouraged Elena, the way they cheered each other on as though they had been friends forever. Something in his chest loosened. As they dried off with paper towels, Evelyn stepped up beside him. She handed Sophie a scarf, then glanced at Garrett. "They get along well," she said simply. Garrett nodded, his gaze still on the girls. "Elena doesn't usually open up this fast." Evelyn gave a small smile.
"Sometimes children know what adults forget. They see who they can trust."
Garrett glanced at her, curious about the weight in her tone. But before he could respond, Elena tugged Sophie toward another booth. "Come on, there's caramel popcorn!" The two girls dashed off, leaving Garrett and Evelyn to follow at a slower pace. The afternoon carried on with the easy rhythm of small-town celebration. Elena and Sophie skipped from stall to stall, their mittened hands sticky with caramel, their pockets jingling with a few coins Garrett had pressed into them. They rode the small carousel, its wooden horses gleaming with chipped paint, and returned breathless to beg Evelyn for a sip of hot cider. Garrett found himself drawn into the ordinary rituals he had long forgotten, standing in line for funnel cakes, handing napkins to the girls as powdered sugar dusted their coats, even dropping a bill into a fiddler's case as the man grinned and tipped his hat. For a man who measured his life in quarterly reports, it was strangely grounding to stand shoulder to shoulder with strangers, all simply enjoying a crisp October evening. At one point, Elena tugged Sophie toward a craft booth where necklaces, bracelets, and rings glimmered under lantern light. The vendor, an older woman with a voice like smoke, encouraged them to try things on. Elena slipped a beaded bracelet over her wrist, giggling. Sophie hesitated, fingers brushing her own chest, as if to make sure the necklace she wore was still there. That was when it happened. As Sophie leaned forward to admire a ring, the clasp of her locket slipped loose. The silver oval swung free, catching the lantern glow, before tumbling softly into the straw-strewn street. She gasped and bent quickly to retrieve it, But Garrett had already seen. His breath caught. The locket was worn smooth, the kind you could thumb open to reveal a picture inside. He remembered it vividly because he had given one just like it decades ago to the woman who had once owned his heart. Sophie straightened, fastening it back around her neck. She looked embarrassed, as though the necklace's fall had exposed something private. "Sorry," she murmured. Before Garrett could speak, Evelyn appeared at her granddaughter's side. She fixed the clasp with practiced fingers, her expression calm but her jaw tight. When her eyes lifted to Garrett's, they held a warning. "Be careful with it, Sophie," Evelyn said gently. "It's precious." Sophie nodded, darting off toward Elena, who was calling her from the popcorn stand. The two girls ran, laughter trailing behind them. Garrett remained rooted. "That locket?" he said under his breath. "Where did she get it?" Evelyn's gaze did not waver. It was her mother's. The words struck him like a hammer. Memories he had sealed away rose unbidden of autumn nights, of laughter by the river, of promises he had never kept. His chest tightened. Evelyn seemed to sense it. She placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Some things are better left in the past, Mr. Holloway." But Garrett couldn't look away. Across the square, Sophie tossed a piece of caramel corn into Elena's mouth, both girls giggling as music swirled around them. For the first time, Garrett felt his carefully built world shifting, threatening to crack open with questions he wasn't ready to ask. The fiddler's tune rose, drums joining in, couples dancing under the lanterns. Children clapped in time, their faces painted with foxes and witches. All around him, life was bursting with color and sound. And yet, in the center of it all, Garrett stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the child with the locket. In the music and laughter of the festival, Garrett whispered, "This can't be, could it?" Rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of Garrett Holloway's office, tracing silver rivulets down the glass until the city beyond blurred. The towers of Boston, usually sharp and commanding, melted into mist. It was late afternoon, the time he would normally be reviewing contracts or preparing for another meeting. Instead, Garrett sat at his mahogany desk, a single lamp casting a pool of yellow light across papers he hadn't touched. His thoughts circled the same image, the glint of a silver locket swaying against Sophie Marlowe's chest at the Harvest Festival. No matter how he tried to push it aside, memory returned with merciless clarity. Years ago, when autumn nights were filled with promise, he had pressed a nearly identical locket into the hands of a woman he loved. He remembered her laughter, the way her hair caught the lamplight, the way she tucked the gift close as though it were a secret treasure. He had not seen her since. Now, decades later, a child wore that same piece. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, retrieving an old leather-bound box he rarely touched. Inside, beneath faded letters and forgotten photographs, lay a picture creased at the corners, colors softened by time. The woman smiled from the print, her face alive with warmth that still pierced him after all these years. He stared at it, his breath shallow. Sophie's eyes were the same. The door creaked, breaking his reverie. Julian Cross, his trusted aide, stepped inside. Dapper, as always, in his tailored suit, Julian carried a portfolio under one arm and the air of a man who knew exactly how to navigate power. "Sir," Julian began smoothly, "I noticed you canceled the finance call this afternoon. Is everything all right?" Garrett slid the photograph back into the drawer, closing it with more force than necessary. "Just needed a moment. What do you have for me?" Julian set the portfolio on the desk, but didn't open it. Instead, his eyes lingered, sharp with curiosity. "It's not like you to be distracted." Garrett met his gaze coolly. Even titans of industry are allowed a thought or two outside the boardroom. Julian chuckled lightly, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. He inclined his head, collecting the silent message. Something personal gnawed at Garrett. Something he wasn't sharing. "I'll reschedule the meeting," Julian said at last. "Shall I leave you to it?" Garrett waved him off. When the door clicked shut, he leaned back in his chair, staring once more at the rain-smeared skyline. He had built his life on control, every variable calculated, every risk managed. Yet here was something he could not quantify, a necklace, a memory, a resemblance too strong to ignore. The thought was both terrifying and irresistible. Night settled heavily over Boston, the rain easing into a mist that blurred the streetlights below. Garrett's office remained lit, a golden square high above the city, while the rest of the building emptied into silence. He sat before his computer, restless, chasing answers that refused to come. He opened old archives, files buried so deep he had almost forgotten they existed, newspaper clippings, corporate records, an alumni directory from his university days. And finally, digital scans of photographs long since tucked away. With each image, the resemblance struck sharper. The curve of a cheek, the glint in the eyes. Sophie's face echoed a woman he had once promised to love and protect. He rubbed his temples, unsettled. If it were true, if the locket meant what he thought, then Sophie was not just a coincidence in Elena's life. She was blood, his blood. A knock broke his concentration. Julian returned, portfolio in hand, though his expression was different now, harder, calculating. "Still here?" Garrett asked, his voice weary. Julian set the portfolio down with deliberate care. "Victor Langford has been making moves. He believes you're distracted, vulnerable." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Victor will find I am neither." "Perhaps," Julian said smoothly, though his tone carried a subtle warning. "But perception can be as dangerous as fact. He's asking questions about your personal life, about the girl." Garrett stiffened. "What girl?" Julian tilted his head, almost sympathetic. "The one seen with your daughter in Salem. People notice, Garrett. And Victor intends to use it." For a moment, Garrett could only stare. The idea that Victor Langford, his oldest rival, might dig into Sophie's life made his stomach tighten with dread. Business feuds he could manage. Private ghosts were another matter. "You'll keep this between us," Garrett ordered, his voice low. Julian gave a small bow of his head. "Of course. I serve you. Always." But as he left, the shadow of a smile lingered at the corner of his mouth. Alone again, Garrett turned back to his screen. His hand trembled slightly as he clicked through old images, until one stopped him cold. A photograph from decades ago, taken on a campus lawn. The woman smiled at the camera. A silver locket resting against her collarbone. The same shape, the same shine. Garrett leaned closer, zooming in until the pixels blurred. His breath caught in his throat, his chest heavy with something between fear and hope. His eyes burned as the words slipped out, ragged and raw. "Sophie? Is she mine?" The call came just after dusk. Garrett had been at his penthouse, pacing, unable to settle after the revelations that haunted him. He had promised Elena an evening together, ice cream, maybe a movie, but when he emerged from his study, the apartment was silent. "Elena?" His voice carried down the hall. No answer. He checked her room. Empty. Then he saw the note, scrawled in Elena's handwriting. "Going to meet Sophie at the library. Back soon." Garrett's chest tightened. Sophie. His mind leapt to every possibility. What if Victor had noticed? What if Julian had spoken? He tried to steady himself, but unease swelled with each passing second. He called the library. No sign of the girls. Panic sharpened his thoughts. He phoned Evelyn's number. It rang endlessly without answer. Then another call came. Blocked number. A voice distorted, but chillingly clear. "If you want to see them safe, come to the docks. Pier 9. No police." The line went dead. Garrett's blood turned cold. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and keys, summoning the driver. The ride to Boston Harbor stretched like an eternity, the city's lights a blur through the rain-streaked windows. He clenched his fists, silent, his mind racing between fear and fury. The harbor was nearly deserted. Warehouses loomed against the black water, their metal siding groaning under the wind. The smell of salt and oil filled the air. Garrett stepped out alone, the driver instructed to wait. Inside the dim warehouse, shadows stretched long across the concrete floor. And there, in the center, he saw them. Elena clutching Sophie's hand, both girls wide-eyed, Evelyn bound to a chair nearby. From the gloom emerged Victor Langford, sharp suit, incongruous against the rusted backdrop, and behind him, Julian Cross. "Garrett Halloway," Victor drawled, his voice slick with triumph. The untouchable finally touched. How quickly empires crack when the heart is exposed. Garrett's eyes locked on Elena. "Let them go." Victor smirked. "Oh, I will. When you sign over your company. Tonight. Everything you built. In exchange for their safety." Julian stepped forward, producing a folder of documents. "All ready, sir. Just your signature." Garrett's pulse thundered. He had faced hostile takeovers, boardroom wars, even betrayals, but never with his daughter's hand trembling in another child's grasp. His empire had always been his life. Now, it felt like ash compared to the sight before him. The warehouse lights flickered, casting broken shadows across the concrete. Elena clung tighter to Sophie, their small hands locked, knuckles white. Garrett stepped forward, every nerve alight, the echo of his shoes sharp in the cavernous space. "You think I care about contracts?" he said, his voice low but shaking. "My daughter is standing right there. That's all that matters." Victor's smile widened, cruel and calculated. "Then prove it. Sign, and they walk out free." Julian extended the folder, the pen glinting under the weak overhead light. Garrett stared at it, the empire of decades reduced to a single decision. But even as his hand hovered, Evelyn's voice rang out, hoarse but strong. "Garrett, stop." Victor turned, annoyed. "Quiet, old woman." But Evelyn pressed on, her eyes burning into Garrett's. "You need to know the truth. Sophie, she isn't just some girl who crossed your path. She's yours. She is your daughter." The words slammed into the room, shattering the stalemate. Garrett froze. His eyes darted to Sophie, to the frightened child clutching Elena. He saw it then, not just resemblance, not just the locket, but something deeper, undeniable. His breath caught in his throat, his chest aching. Victor scoffed. "Pathetic. Do you really expect him to believe?" But Garrett wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. "Is it true?" Evelyn nodded, tears streaking her face. "Her mother never told you. She thought you'd moved on, that your world had no room for her. But Sophie is yours, Garrett. She always has been." For a moment, the warehouse fell into silence, broken only by the creak of the rafters and the girls' shallow breaths. Garrett's hand dropped from the pen. He looked at Julian, then Victor, his voice firm now, laced with something that hadn't been there before. "I don't care about the company. Take it, burn it, do whatever you want. But you will not touch my children." He stepped between the girls and the men, his body a shield. Elena buried her face in his side. Sophie hesitated, then leaned closer, clutching his coat. For the first time, Garrett felt her weight against him, fragile and real, a connection he had long been denied. Victor's sneer faltered. Before he could reply, red and blue lights flashed through the high windows. Sirens wailed outside, growing louder, closer. "You called them," Victor snarled. Garrett shook his head. "I didn't have to." He glanced at Evelyn, who managed a faint smile even through her tears. The doors burst open. Officers stormed in, voices commanding, weapons raised. Chaos erupted, Victor shouting, Julian protesting, footsteps pounding across the floor. But Garrett barely noticed. On his knees, he pulled both girls into his arms, holding them as though the world itself might break apart if he let go. His cheek pressed to Sophie's hair, his voice raw with regret. "Forgive me, Sophie. M." The cottage stood at the edge of the dunes, small and weather-worn, but tonight it felt like a sanctuary. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond, its waves crashing in steady rhythm, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Garrett parked the car slowly, letting the engine quiet before he spoke. "We're here," he said, glancing into the back seat. Elena stirred first, rubbing her eyes. Sophie leaned against her shoulder, reluctant to move, as though waking might return her to a world less safe. Evelyn, weary but dignified, placed a hand on both girls before they climbed out. The porch creaked under their weight. Garrett unlocked the door, and the warm glow of the caretaker's lamps spilled across the wooden floorboards. Inside, the cottage was modest but comforting. Shelves filled with seashells, quilts folded neatly on chairs, a stone fireplace still carrying the faint scent of old fires. Elena darted to the window.
"Dad, you can see the ocean from here!"
"Embry." Garrett joined her, standing behind her small frame. The horizon stretched wide, painted by the last blush of sunset. Sophie hovered nearby, silent, as though unsure whether to claim the view as hers. Evelyn eased into a chair, her hands folded in her lap. "This place," she murmured, "feels like it's been waiting for us." Garrett nodded, though he did not admit how rarely he had come here. For years, the cottage had been an afterthought, a possession, a retreat he never used. Now, it seemed to hold a purpose he had never recognized. The girls set about exploring, opening cupboards, peering into corners. Elena discovered a basket of old board games. Sophie found a shelf of children's books, their covers faded. They giggled as they dusted them off, as if uncovering treasure. By the time dusk had turned to night, the kitchen was alive with the sound of cooking. Evelyn chopped vegetables with the ease of long habit. Garrett, awkward with a paring knife, peeled potatoes slowly but carefully. Elena stood on a stool to stir the pot of gravy, while Sophie arranged plates at the small wooden table. "Don't forget the forks," Elena reminded, her tone bossy but sweet. Sophie smiled, placing each fork with precision. "And the napkins folded like triangles," she added, mimicking what Elena had shown her. Garrett paused, watching the scene. For decades, his evenings had been marked by catered meals and silent dining rooms. Tonight, the clatter of spoons, the bubbling of a pot, and the chatter of children filled the space instead. It was new, unfamiliar, and yet it felt like something he had been missing all along. Dinner that night was not perfect, at least not in the way Garrett once demanded perfection. The chicken browned unevenly, the potatoes were a little lumpy, and Elena had spilled salt on the counter. Yet as the four of them gathered at the table, candles flickering in the draft from the sea, Garrett thought he had never seen a finer meal. The girls dug in eagerly, passing bowls back and forth with the solemnity of ritual. Sophie handed Elena the gravy boat, careful not to spill. Elena returned with a spoonful of mashed potatoes. Evelyn watched them both, her expression softening into something lighter than Garrett had seen in days. For a long time, they ate quietly, the crackle of the candle and the roar of the surf filling the silence. Then, Elena, ever the bold one, broke it.
"This feels like Thanksgiving," she declared.
Garrett chuckled. "Except it's October and the turkey is a chicken." Sophie giggled, covering her mouth.
"It still feels special."
Her words settled over the table, heavier than she knew. Garrett's fork paused. He had given Elena gifts, yes, but he had never given her evenings like this. And Sophie, how many dinners had she eaten in a dim apartment, wishing for something more? He swallowed hard, feeling the truth pressing at him. Evelyn set down her glass. "There's something about sharing food," she said softly. "It reminds us we're not alone. For years, Sophie and I had only each other at this table. I thought it was enough." She looked at Garrett. "But maybe I was wrong." The weight of her confession struck him. He leaned forward, his hands folding over hers across the table. "You carried more than your share. I can't change what I missed, Evelyn. But I can be here now." The room went still. Sophie's eyes shimmered as she looked between them. Her hand tightened around her fork. Then, slowly, she set it down. Her voice trembled. "Dad?" The single word seemed to echo louder than the surf outside. Garrett froze, breath caught, eyes burning. He rose slowly from his chair, moving to her side. She looked up at him, uncertain, afraid she had said too much. But when he knelt beside her, arms open, Sophie leaned into him as though she had been waiting all her life. He held her, held Elena when she hurried to wrap her arms around them too. The three of them pressed together, a tangle of tears and laughter, while Evelyn watched with shining eyes. For Garrett, the moment was overwhelming. All the years of distance, of chasing shadows of success, melted into something real and raw. The weight of two daughters against his chest. Evelyn whispered almost to herself, "Sometimes the past has to break us, so the present can heal us." No one spoke after that. Words were no longer needed. Later, as the dishes were cleared and the girls carried their drawings to the mantel, Garrett stepped outside for a moment. The ocean wind was sharp, tugging at his coat, but behind him, through the glowing windows, he saw them, Evelyn, Sophie, Elena, moving around the kitchen, laughing, arranging leftovers. For the first time in decades, the sight of light spilling from a home felt like a promise kept. The windows glowed warm against the sea breeze, laughter echoing into the night, sealing Garrett's redemption with the gift of family. In the end, when the storm had passed and the harbor lights gave way to the quiet of Cape Cod, it wasn't the battles of business or the weight of old regrets that lingered. What stayed was the sight of two little girls finding laughter at a dinner table, and a man who finally discovered that success was never measured in glass towers, but in the warmth of arms around him. The past had been heavy, yes, but like autumn leaves carried out to sea, it drifted into memory. making room for something gentler to grow. Stories like this remind us of something simple and true. Love has the power to redeem even the coldest heart. A man can be forgiven, and he can begin again, if only he has the courage to choose family over pride. Isn't that what we all long for, deep down in our later years, to know that our place at the table will always be set, no matter how late we arrive? The lesson is clear, yet never grows old. Love is stronger than regret. Forgiveness heals what ambition cannot. And family, whether by blood or by choice, is the truest wealth we can ever hope to leave behind. Like a lamp glowing quietly in a farmhouse window on a dark New England night, the smallest act of kindness can guide us safely home. Just as a simple family supper, with mismatched plates and shared laughter, can mean more than the finest banquet in the grandest hall. And so, perhaps the story isn't only Garrett's. Perhaps it belongs to each of us who have made mistakes, each of us who still carry regrets. It whispers that no matter how late the hour, there is always time to sit down, to listen, to say the words we feared were lost. I'm sorry. I love you. Let's begin again. Take a quiet moment tonight and think of your own family, of the ones still with you, or those you hold in memory. Maybe you'll remember a Sunday dinner when everyone was gathered, or the sound of children running through a backyard in summer, or the hush of a Christmas Eve when the house smelled of pine and pie. Those moments, more than anything else, are what endure. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Press 1 in the comments if it warmed you, or 0 if you'd like to share your thoughts or suggestions. Because stories like this are not just told. They're lived, passed down, shared across generations. The windows of the little Cape Cod cottage may have glowed only in fiction, but the lesson they hold is very real. Happiness does not come from what we own, but from who we love. And when the night grows long, it is family, the voices around the table, the laughter carried on the wind that becomes our truest home.